Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today's guest is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Roberts has had careers in scholarship and academia, journalism, public service, and business. He is chairman of the Institute for Political Economy. President Reagan appointed Dr. Roberts Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy. Dr. Roberts' latest book is How the Economy Was Lost, and I am honored to have Dr. Roberts on the X22 Report Spotlight. Welcome, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you. Pleased to be with you.
I wanted to start out today with the economy, and then we're going to move into what the United States has been doing around the world with, it looks like they're pushing war, but we'll get into that. Now, the Fed raised interest rates on the notion that the economy has recovered completely and everything is fine. Do you think at this point that the economy of the United States has completely recovered?
Of course not. There's never been any recovery from the downturn. They produced the illusion of recovery by undermeasuring inflation. So when they deflate the nominal gross domestic product with an understated measure of inflation, they can show a little bit of positive growth. But if you actually measure inflation the way the U.S. government traditionally measured it, there's been no growth whatsoever since the downturn. And they also create the illusion with the way they don't measure unemployment. They don't count discouraged workers. So if you don't count that part of the unemployed who have given up looking for work because there are no jobs to be found, then you're excluding the bulk of the unemployed. If you include these discouraged workers, the unemployment rate is not 5%, it's 23%. John Williams, who runs the website shadowstats.com, documents this monthly based on the traditional way of measuring unemployment. This was abandoned by the government, just as the government abandoned the traditional way of measuring inflation in order to rig the numbers in some positive way. The illusion is also kept alive by the money that the Federal Reserve pumped into the banking system, which pushes up the prices of financial assets. And so the rise in stock prices and bond prices also creates the impression of recovery. But this is all done on the basis of rigging the policy and rigging the information flows.
Where do you think the economy is headed in this year? I mean, we have a lot of financial pundits. We have the IMF. They're saying that growth is a little bit slow, but it looks like it's going to pick up towards the end of the year. Do you see the economy getting better anytime soon?
No, I don't. It doesn't seem possible for it to get better. If you think about it, the main impact of jobs offshoring was to destroy the growth of real median family income in the United States. There's been no growth in real median family income for years or decades, depending on how you go about measuring it. So if you don't have growth in real median family income, there's nothing to drive consumer demand. And without consumer demand, there's no reason for businesses to invest. And this has been the case now since the beginning of the 21st century. The Federal Reserve's response to the lack of any increase in aggregate demand during Alan Greenspan's term was to cause an expansion in consumer debt. And they relied on the buildup in consumer debt to take the place of the missing growth in consumer income. But this policy, of course, can only last until people reach the point that they can't take on any more debt. You can't take on debt forever if your income is not growing. So they have they have run out of the ability to keep aggregate demand growing by building up consumer debt. So there's nothing to drive the economy. And without something to drive the economy, there's no way for a recovery or a pickup.
Now, you wrote an interesting article where you say the West is reduced to looting itself. And we see certain things happening. Of course, Obamacare, where there's a lot of taxes involved in that. We see FATCA, where they're going out looking for revenue to bring into the government. What other ways are you saying that they're trying to loot itself?
Well, there are many ways that they do it. For example, consider the sovereign debt situation in Europe. Traditionally, when governments acquired more debt than they could service, the creditors had to write down the debt to the amount that the indebted country could service. You may remember when Mexico announced during the, I think it was the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, that they couldn't service their debt. We had these Brady bonds, which was a way of writing down the Mexican debt to something that could be serviced. But what is happening today is the position is being taken that if a country can't service its debt, that's the fault of the people, and therefore they have to have reduced pensions, reduced government employment, reduced social services, and force down their wages so that the income of the country can be redirected to the creditors. And that these people, you see, this is what is happening in Greece. It's happened in Portugal. It's on the schedule for Italy and Spain. In fact, it's really already being applied there. And in addition, these countries are told that you have to sell off national assets. For example, municipal water companies have to be privatized so that you sell the municipal water company to private investors, almost always from outside the country. And then you use the money you receive to give to the creditors. You also have to sell your ports. The state lottery has to be privatized. And the Greeks are being forced to sell their protected national islands to real estate developers. And this then, you see, loots the country of its living standards. It loots the country of its national properties. So that is one way that the West is looting itself. It's had to turn on its own members to keep profits flowing. Another way was through the offshoring of jobs. Because when you offshore manufacturing jobs, you offshore tradable professional services such as software engineering, information technology, research, design. When you offshore these jobs, you are taking away the career opportunities of your own people. And you're taking away the tax base of cities and states. And look at the plight of Detroit. Look at the plight of Illinois. For example, of course, many cities and states are now in these difficulties. So what happens is the corporations, pushed, of course, by Wall Street and by the big box retailers like Walmart, when they move the jobs offshore to China, their labor costs drop, the profits go up. And so who gets the rewards are the executives of the companies, because they have performance-based bonuses, and performance-based means increased profits. And the shareholders, who get capital gains in the rise in the share price from the increased profits acquired by moving jobs from the United States to China, to Indonesia, to India, where the labor costs are much lower. So this is a form of looting. And this is the reason or the main reason that we have in the United States in recent years this massive growth in the inequality of income and wealth. The United States, which once had a reasonable distribution, now has one of the worst in the world. There are many third world gangster states that have a more equal distribution of income and wealth than the United States today. Another way that the West loots itself is through what Michael Hudson has explained as a financialization of the economy, in which the financial system no longer serves any positive purpose. It serves to capitalize economic rents into debt instruments that result in the flow of interest payments to the financial system. So those are the main ways in which the West is looting itself. It's proceeding at a very rapid pace. And the result is throughout the Western world, very high rates of unemployment, particularly among the young, and the inability of young people to form independent households, to get married, to raise children. This is true in Japan, all over Europe, and in the United States. Perhaps you're aware of the recent report from the Federal Reserve that 50% of American 25-year-olds are living at home with their parents. They can't earn enough to form independent households. So you've got 25-year-olds back in their childhood rooms in their parents' homes, half of the 25-year-old population. So this shows that there's no opportunities for people, there's no jobs, there's no careers, that the ladders of upward mobility that made the United States an opportunity society, these ladders have been dismantled in the interest of very short-term profits for a handful of people.
And as this economy deteriorates and as we move forward and things get worse, we see Washington right now across the ocean in Ukraine, in the Middle East, with North Korea, with China, continually provoking many of the countries overseas. And you wrote an article about how Washington is the greatest threat to world order. What is Washington up to? Why are they pursuing this course right now?
Yes, that's easy to explain. Actually, I've written an entire book, which is my most recent book, The Neoconservative Threat to World Order. The origin of this threat is twofold. You may remember President Eisenhower in his last public address to the American people gave a very strong warning about the military-industrial complex. He warned that in previous times when wars were over, we dismantled the structure, but because of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, this structure was still in place 15 years after the end of World War II, and in fact was larger, and that this was a threat to American democracy, and that we needed to be aware of this and do whatever could be done to prevent this threat from destroying our way of life and our political system. Well, that was in January of 1961. And we've had how many more years? Another more than a half a century of the military-industrial complex. Now it's less industrial, it's military security complex. And its hooks into the American taxpayers are massive and embedded. You couldn't get them out. And this complex benefits from conflict. It was terrified when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, because where was the enemy? And so we needed a new one. The only possible enemy that we could manufacture was the Muslim threat. Here we bring in the neoconservative ideology of American hegemony over the world. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the neoconservatives said, hey, look, history has chosen American democratic capitalism, which is neither democratic nor capitalist, but that's their term, as the only system for the world. And since we represent that system, it makes us the exceptional people, the indispensable country. We are above all other countries. Our will is above the sovereignty of other countries. We are not hampered by international law or our own laws. And it's our responsibility and right to impose American hegemony on the rest of the world. So the neoconservatives use this for launching their wars in the Middle East. Now, the wars, of course, had other purposes as well as establishing American hegemony. It was the beginning. It was the easiest place to start. It was easy to make a threat out of Muslims. With 9/11, they were able to say, oh, look, we have now a terrorist threat. It's a war of terror. Well, at that time, we had Russia under our thumb, because the Yeltsin government, which had taken over after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this was a vassal government of Washington. We essentially controlled their policies, their resources. For a while, we even controlled their nuclear weapons. And we were accustomed to Russia simply following our directions. But while we were focused on these wars, you may remember the wars were supposed to be, what was it, a 3-week war, a 6-week cakewalk. Remember, that would only cost $70 billion and would be paid for by Iraqi oil revenues.
Yes.
You may remember all that. Well, when the neoconservatives got so bogged down over there and all their terrible mistakes and failures, and this thing was going on forever and ever, and they started talking about 30-year wars with terrorists. This was the period when Putin brought Russia back, reestablished its independence, the independence in its foreign policy, its military, which is now easily a match for ours, if not more than a match, because its weapon systems are so far superior, and its morale is superior, and began this reconstruction of Russian independence. Well, when this hit the neocons, which it did, when Putin blocked Obama's planned invasion of Syria, he said no. When he blocked the Washington's planned attack on Iran, he said no. And Washington couldn't do anything about it. So then they said, oh, well, we've got to do something about this Putin figure. What can we do? Well, we had spent over the previous 10 years $5 billion fomenting dissent in Ukraine. We financed a large number of what are called non-governmental organizations. They hide behind things like women's rights, teaching democracy, that sort of thing. And we also had been invested in Ukrainian politicians who would be our guys. And so we arranged that coup in Ukraine and presented Russia with a serious threat right there and on its own border, and what had been part of Russia for centuries. You know, the Ukraine essentially never really been an independent country. It was part of Russia before the Soviets. It was a Soviet republic under the Soviets. Large sections of present-day Ukraine are Russian sections that were added to Ukraine by Soviet rulers, beginning with Lenin and the last being Khrushchev, who stuck Crimea, a part of Russia that Russia fought the Tartars for a long time. Khrushchev stuck that into Ukraine for perhaps administrative reasons, but really to make amends because he himself was Ukrainian. So we created this situation there. Well, part of that situation is that so many of those in the western part of Ukraine have political links back to the Ukrainians who fought for Hitler during World War II against the Soviet Union. So by resurrecting those people, we created huge troubles between Ukraine and its Russian populations in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, and of course, Crimea. This was an effort on the part of the United States government to grab the Russian Black Sea naval base in Crimea. That's Russia's only warm water port. The people in Crimea are Russian. And they voted, nope, we're not having anything to do with this American puppet state and these neo-Nazis in Kiev. And they asked Russia to please take them back where they had been for centuries until 1954, when Khrushchev gifted them to the Ukraine Socialist Soviet Republic. Well, the next event was the Ukrainian tax on the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, which produced the two republics now that have declared their independence. So we have managed to create in Ukraine serious problems for the Russians and also for Europe, because this is now, Ukraine is now going down the tubes. It's busted. It hasn't really any prospects. And the Russians have made it clear they're not going to accept Ukraine as a NATO member, and they're not going to permit American or NATO military bases in Ukraine on their border. So this is how that came about. It was an effort on the part of the neoconservatives who dominate American foreign policy and have since the second Clinton term. They're the ones that were responsible for the illegal American attacks on Yugoslavia, on Serbia, the dismantling of Kosovo from Serbia. They're responsible for all of the wars of the Bush and Obama regimes. They dominate American foreign policy. And so they said, okay, we're going to teach Putin a lesson and get him back in line. And so that's where the trouble in the Ukraine came from. But it blew up on them as well. But nothing they have done, nothing they, being the neoconservatives, have done has worked. It's mainly created immense problems for the world. And this claim that they put forward of American hegemony, this is a threat to every country. Essentially, it says that there can be no countries with independent foreign policies, and there can be no countries strong enough to resist Washington's will. Well, that puts you at war with the world. And we have seen one consequence has been this strategic alliance between Russia and China. It's both economic and military. Well, the United States is not a match for the combination of Russia and China. And yet the neocons keep pressing these provocative issues. If you look at the demonization of the leader of Russia, who is without any doubt the most popular politician in the world, there's far more world support than this fool in the White House. You demonize the leader of a country that's that powerful. The new Hitler, a corrupt multi-billionaire. He invaded Ukraine. He's going to invade Poland and the Baltics. He's going to put back together the Soviet Union. All of this is blatant nonsense. And yet it creates a very hostile diplomatic situation. And all of Europe, being American vassal states, are drawn into it. So Washington has forced all of the European countries into a hostile situation with regard to Russia.
We see Putin, he continually tries to control the situation and push peace instead of war. And it seems like every time they try to do something, he calms the situation down and tries to find a diplomatic solution.
Correct.
And it seems like it messes up their plans every single time. And now we see that Putin is now in Syria, hitting the Islamic State, which is a problem for the United States government. And this is posing a huge problem for them. And they initiated these peace talks. Where do you think these peace talks are going to end up? I mean, do you think there's going to be peace in Syria?
The United States never uses peace talks in order to achieve peace. They use it to gain time, to mislead the person on the other side. It's not for the purpose of peace. So there's no such thing as Syrian peace talks. Now, the Islamic State is a creation of the United States. We have had this publicly stated by the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the intelligence agency of the U.S. military, Pentagon. He has said, yes, we created ISIS and we used them to overthrow countries. So ISIS was sent to Syria by the United States when Putin told Obama, no, you are not going to invade Syria. Red line, no red line, you're not going there. So we sent ISIS and we pretended that this was a rebel opposition group from within Syria opposing a brutal dictator. All of this is made up hogwash. So we put them there trying to overthrow Assad because the Russians told us they weren't going to permit us to do it. Well, from the standpoint of Russia, which has many Muslim populations in different parts of the Russian Federation, having an Islamic State controlling Iraq and Syria, this is very dangerous because they now can export all of that into Russia, also into Iran and into Russia. And so this is what's drawn Iran and Russia into an alliance. So Russia really has no alternative but to prevent the formation of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And that's the reason that Putin went in with the Air Force, which was to provide support for the Syrian army. And it's worked so far. They have rolled back ISIS, they've stopped the advance of ISIS, and it looks like they've essentially defeated ISIS. So why is the United States getting in all of a sudden? Most likely, this is the neoconservatives hoping to get a military presence there on the ground that they can bring into conflict with Russia and start a war. Because then that forces Europe into the war. And then that forces Russia to defend a huge border from the Baltics all the way, to Montenegro. I mean, you've got the whole thing to Macedonia, to Georgia, off on the Black Sea, to Ukraine. So this is extremely dangerous because this will be World War III, and World War III will be nuclear. It will be the end of all of us. And the American people are really quite silly to sit around and believe all this crap about the Russian threat. The threat is in Washington. It's this neoconservative claim of American hegemony over the world. And this constant demonization of governments and leaders that we intend to destroy. They're demonizing Putin worse than they demonized Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or Assad in Syria. They actually demonize Putin worse than they do the North Korean guy. Well, the Russians know this. The Chinese know this. They see where this is going. Yes, they try to diffuse it. I think the strategy of Russia is to hope that the idiots in Europe will wake up and see that they're being forced into a conflict in which they have no stake, which would result in the total destruction of Europe. You know, any kind of war that we force with Russia means Europe ceases to exist. It'd just be annihilated. There'd be nothing there but a radioactive wasteland. Well, the Europeans have any stake in this. And without the Europeans, Washington can't force this conflict on Russia. We wouldn't have the forward bases. We wouldn't have the diplomatic support. We wouldn't have all the vassal states repeating our propaganda. And so I think what the Russian government is doing is hoping that, you know, let's just keep diffusing this, and maybe the Europeans will understand that they are being used and abused and forced into a conflict that will destroy them, and that they have nothing whatsoever to gain from being enablers of American hegemony. So that's the Putin-Russian strategy, and that's why they don't respond in kind. They're not provocative in response. They're very low-key because they understand that life on Earth is what's at stake. And apparently Washington has no concern whatsoever about life on Earth. That's irrelevant compared to Washington's hegemony over the world. And this is the danger. And this is what I mean by Washington being the greatest threat.
How far, this is my last question for you, but how far will these neocons go to start this war? What tactics will they use to push this?
Well, look what they've done so far. 9/11. I mean, no sensible person believes this was bin Laden. This was an inside job. This gave the neocons what they said they had to have to start their wars, which was a new Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. We've seen all the other false flag attacks, the ones in Paris. It's all geared toward forcing the European vassals to support our wars against the Muslims. If they're supporting you against the Muslims, then they got to support you also when you go against the Russians. They'll do anything because to them, they've been chosen by history. They've got history on their side. This is like the Jacobins of the French Revolution. You know, we're going to bring the French system to all Europe. It gave us the 20 years Napoleonic Wars. Well, if they had nuclear weapons in those days, there wouldn't be any world here now. This is the same thing. It's actually worse than the Nazi claim of being the Superman and deserving more territory. The Germans didn't claim the whole world. The Nazis didn't claim the whole world. The neocons do.
Right.
So this is extremely dangerous. They'll go to any lengths, as long as they're in power, as long as they're influential. And it's hard to see who the counterparts are. You know, the old Republican establishment tried to restrain this early on. You may remember that when the George W. Bush regime began these wars, we had what was the Baker-Hamilton report. Well, Baker was Jim Baker, the chief of staff of the Reagan White House, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State for George Herbert Walker Bush, you know, the main operating agent of the Republican establishment, Jim Baker. Hamilton was the Republican leader in the House in one of the important committees. They issued a report pointing out that the George W. Bush approach was disastrous, would be disastrous, and it should be abandoned. And they were absolutely crucified by the neoconservatives. So we've had a situation where the neoconservatives have displaced the old Republican establishment. And the Republican establishment essentially is defunct. And this shows up in all the foreign policy discussions in the Journal of Foreign Affairs and the Trilateral Commission, in the Council on Foreign Relations, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, all the magazines, Fox News, CNN. This is all the neocon view of the world. So they're kind of supreme. There's no check on them inside the United States or inside Europe. They've spread this into England, into France. So you've got a situation that's extremely serious. And if Putin is able to handle this, he'll go down as the greatest leader in world history.
Dr. Roberts, thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. How can people read your articles? Where do they have to go to see this?
Well, my articles are reproduced everywhere in many languages. My own site is very easy to get. It's just www.paulcraigroberts.org. So all the articles are there, as well as the references to the books. What we have talked about today is covered in The Neoconservative Threat to World Order, How America Was Lost, and The Failure of Laissez-Faire Capitalism. These are all new books within the last year or two, and they're all available there.
Thank you for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. I really appreciate you coming on here. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate your interest.